fully benefit from the contribution which our culture can make to the greater well-being of the whole society. The states we come from should recognize with honesty and clarity the collective ownership to the lands and waters traditionally used by each indigenous group. We request the obvious, that the governments of each state from which we come recognize our rights as peoples entitled to the dignity of self-fulfillment and realization. That further means that there must not be any displacement or interference with our rights by governments and or industry, nor can there be any disturbance of our lands. In any negotiations of crucial issues, we expect participation on a position of full equality. End of quote. Yes, they were so wise, eh? This is 51 years ago. The second resolution called on the establishment of a circumpolar body of indigenous peoples' collaboration. And the fact that our leaders met in 1973, pushing and paving and driving the development towards greater and stronger and more institutionalized cooperation in the Arctic, I believe is the foundation that the Arctic Council was built on. Let's look at what the peoples did after 1973. The Saami Council had already been established. The Inuit Circumpolar Council came from those Inuit who came to Copenhagen in 1973 thinking, we need to have our Alaskan fellow Inuit take part. So in 1977, the Inuit Circumpolar Council was established. And one of the first things that the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, as it was named back then, was to call on the Soviet Union to allow Inuit from Chukotka to take part in our cooperation. They continued to push. They traveled to Chukotka, they traveled to Moscow in full understanding of the challenges that would bring. Today, we also understand the full challenges of the current situation. And we insist on being united as Inuit peoples across Inuit homelands, spanning from Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka. This is the people-to-people and cross-border cooperation that we have built over decades. I looked back at the records and saw that in 1983 was the first time that ICC used our ECOSOC accreditation to the UN. What kind of meeting was it? It was a meeting in Africa about endangered species. The then West Germany had been working on banning the hunt of seals and whales. So our leaders went there, told the world about our way of life, our identity, our relation and interrelatedness with the nature around us, and the reasons why it is important that we can live from those resources as we have done for millennia. If our leaders had not done so, the international instruments we see today on climate, biodiversity, environment, and all the other areas of marine governance and governance in general would not have looked the way that they do today. Recently, when the High Seas Treaty on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction was finalized, there is language in there on the knowledge of indigenous peoples. When the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement was finalized, there is language in there on our rights and our knowledge. Those things did not happen on their own. In the same way, the Arctic Council was established, co-founded by Arctic indigenous peoples, based on the long process of diplomacy and insistence on being able to collaborate, started in the 70s. And the Arctic Council would not be the Arctic Council if the 6 permanent participants are not fully part of the Arctic Council. And we all understand the challenges that the Arctic Council is facing. We are therefore in full support of the current work to resume work, the Arctic Council is not on pause. The Arctic Council is working. Inuit, Gwich'in, Saami, all others are working to do the work that we were tasked to do by those who came before us and established this important body of governance. So the work that is done in the Arctic Council must continue to be strengthened, and I call on everyone in this room to continue supporting that work, continue to do the work, but also open your minds and make sure that the needed changes in the way we work are implemented. Because unfortunately, when reading the resolutions from '73, too much of what it says is still the way it is today. Too much of what is said in those resolutions from '73 are still the challenges we face today. So when we met in Ilulissat last summer, our youth were there. The youth from our peoples, I'm looking at some of them here. Of the 40 delegates, 15 were youth. And you should have seen them. You should have seen how they insisted on focusing not only on everything that we had been running around the corridors of the UN talking about, anti-discrimination, recognition as peoples, but also the need to decolonize, the need deliberately to work together to change things so that the way we work does not continue the power struggles and the power inequities and other inequities that we continue to face also within research. So this is the challenge that we stand with here, that we also make those changes within the Arctic Council, that we make it stronger, that we safeguard it, and I believe we best safeguard it but by making it the main venue where these processes and ways of thinking, inclusive of the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, understanding the contributions, are fully implemented. So I look forward to listening and being part of this discussion and debate, and I look forward to following the work of the esteemed researchers and knowledge holders and scientists in the room from any knowledge regime, and I especially look forward to continuing as leaders of the Arctic to work together in making sure that we continue to have a peaceful Arctic where we can cooperate with open eyes and open ears. We know the challenges, and it takes political will to stay at the table. Røyana.
Thank you very much, Sara. A strong statement, I would say, in the beginning of this panel discussion. I didn't introduce myself, but my name is on the board, so. We will now turn to each and every one of you, not to you, Sara, but the other ones, to give a short introductory statement. So please, Nicole, you can start.
Okay. Well, first, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this panel. I know it's getting a little bit late in the day, and we're wrapping up our conference here, so I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here today with my esteemed panelists, and I am looking forward to a very engaging and exciting discussion. Now, to start, as we know, climate impacts are worsening all around the globe. If we just use my home country as an example of Canada, on the western coast, there are raging wildfires. The province of British Columbia has seen some of the worst wildfires that they've seen in decades. In fact, the year 2023 was described as the most destructive and costly wildfire season they've seen. If we flip it around over to the east coast, the waters are warming off the coast here, and this means that these hurricanes that had originated in the Atlantic Ocean can now travel up the coast. They're sustaining their energy, and they're making landfall in our maritime provinces. We are absolutely not used to this frequency and severity of hurricanes. There used to be colder waters off our coast. If we move to the north coast of Canada now, what we're seeing is very rapid permafrost thaw as well as coastal erosion. And in some communities like Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories, there are homes that are literally sitting right on the coast and about to fall into the ocean. So we really do see it all in Canada, and we understand the need to adapt to these climate impacts. It's broadly acknowledged. We already understand the urgency of adaptation. We can use various different measures. You can break it down into protective or structural adaptations, so think things like seawalls, levees, shoreline armoring. We can use non-structural adaptations, like maybe let's set back our development from the coast instead of developing right on the water. We can use ecosystem-based approaches. And finally, perhaps the most debated adaptation strategy, we can retreat or relocate. Now, it's important to note that not all of these adaptation strategies are viewed as important or urgent. What we see is that in practice, structural adaptations continue to dominate the landscape. But the relocation of vulnerable infrastructure and residents out of these hazardous locations is still featuring lower on our list of adaptation priorities. And this is important because as these climate stressors worsen, as we see things getting a little bit crazy like we are in Canada, the need to employ relocation may be very urgent. It may be our only viable option left. And so this is what I look at in my research. My PhD research looks into local scale planning for climate-induced relocation across 5 different Canadian provinces and territories. Now, before we get into our discussion, I wanted to highlight why I'm even looking through a local planning lens and why it's important to explore adaptation through this planning lens. Before I get ahead of myself, I might be jumping the gun here, but part of the reason as to why we do see this enhanced exposure and vulnerability to climate impacts is because of where we've developed in the first place. We like to develop on water bodies, not just for the view, but in the past for transportation, for trade, etc. But let's get back to it. Why I'm studying relocation and adaptation through a planning lens and through a local scale lens is for several different reasons. First, local governments are the level of government closest to the resident. They understand how climate impacts are affecting infrastructure, utilities, assets, their own resident safety and well-being. Local governments are on the front lines of climate impacts. They're really bearing the brunt of everything that climate change has to throw at them. And second off, or I guess maybe that's third off, but local governments possess these planning tools that can be used to actually implement adaptation goals and policies in practice. Now, these tools are also very effective vehicles for the mainstreaming of adaptation content. And this helps to ensure that our action around adaptation is aligning with our community values, goals, and priorities. So I will leave it there. I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I think we continue with you, Julius, please.
Right. Hello. Yeah, Buddhist everyone. Welcome to Bodø. Well, I'll just begin with saying straight off that climate change is certainly not a stranger anymore to the Saami people. It is very much a lived reality that threatens our very existence. The traditional Saami ways of life that are deeply woven with nature, though they are under heavy stress due to the accelerating pace of climate change. The impacts have many layers and are cascading. Not only do they affect the environment, but also the socio-economic and cultural fabric of our society. The warming climate has already changed the landscape of Sápmi, leading to the loss of biodiversity, changes in weather patterns, and the melting of permafrost, of course. And these changes, they further disrupt reindeer herding, fishing, and many other important traditional practices that make up our livelihood. Our reindeer herders, for instance, face increasingly unpredictable and harsh weather conditions, which makes it difficult to sustain our tradition. That's one of the defining traits of our cultural identity. So, while the push for green transition is certainly essential and required to address this new challenges and issues, this also poses us a sort of paradoxical threat to our lands. So the expansion of wind farms, the establishment of new mining projects, and other industrial activities that are often justified in the name of sustainable development, well, they heavily encroach upon the lands where we live, and furthermore, they divide them. So this form that has been given a name, green colonialism, this only worsens and pressures our communities and makes it so that climate change becomes a double burden for us and even threatens our rights to self-determination. So the Saami Council firmly believes that effective climate action must involve the equitable participation of indigenous peoples. Our traditional knowledge, cultural practices offer valuable insights and sustainable solutions that contribute to climate resilience. It is therefore important that our voices are heard and integrated into policy-making processes at all levels as a response to this modern crisis of ours. Our resilience and traditional knowledge will be vital resources in the fight against climate change and the adaptation work in it. Gitu. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Julius. I hope we can discuss this further when all the introductions are made. I think I'll go to Kikki before we go to the two excellencies. Kikki, please.
Thank you. I'm a climate researcher. I'm an ocean expert. I look at the ocean in 3 dimensions. I go back in time and reconstruct climate change that has happened. I'm observing what's happening today, and we're trying to model what will happen in the future. Okay. But perhaps the strongest evidence of climate change is what space is telling us, because we can see climate change from space. For over 4 decades, we've collected satellite images, and we look at the face that this part of the world, the Arctic, is showing. We see the change. It's so phenomenal. We see that the Arctic summer is now blue, green, and warm. It's not cold and white anymore. We see that the Arctic Ocean blanket of what used to be thick old ice is now thin, barely seasonal ice. And we're also seeing that the supply of more and more warm Atlantic water into the Arctic are changing the Arctic. It's becoming more like the Atlantic, the Atlantification. And the magnitude of the projected climate changes, or the impacts of them, are up to 3 times the global average in the Arctic, the rate of it. And the scale and the interconnectedness, and in addition to the speed of change, leaves what many people think is a more and more limited window for action on adaptation in the Arctic. But because Arctic populations has often been identified as very highly vulnerable within a global climate change discourse, this is often asserted in scientific report and assessment or in global meetings, and is typically used to underscore the need for even more mitigation. And in these studies, we often find that the adaptation is focusing on responding to climate change projections, but we focus on techno-engineering adaptation. However, and very conversely, field-based studies demonstrate a significant adaptive capacity among Arctic people themselves, identifying that the drivers of vulnerability are often non-climate related stresses, and that barriers can be overcome.
Good, thank you so much. So adaptation may be possible, but we are going to give the word to Erik and last but not least, Morten afterwards.
Okay.
So please, Erik, what is your view on the climate and environment questions?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to be on the panel. I'm very happy to be here and with the audience. And it's great to be back in Norway. I had the good fortune of actually living in Norway for 3 years with my family when I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Oslo. It's also good to be back in Bodø. I've traveled a lot in the Arctic over the last couple of years, but the very first place that I ever went to north of the Arctic Circle was Bodø. So it's good to be back here. So the main question, as you all have heard for this panel, is one of the most critical questions that faces the Arctic. How can we mitigate and adapt to the rapid changes that are occurring in the Arctic resulting from climate change? It's, of course, a well-known fact that the Arctic is undergoing a dramatic transformation driven by climate change, with impacts that affect not only the communities that live in the Arctic and the Arctic states, but the rest of the world. Some of you may be familiar with the, well, first of all, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA is the acronym in the United States, puts out an Arctic report card that some of you may have seen. And the most recent Arctic report card, which is a peer-reviewed source for environmental information, noted things like record-breaking precipitation, continued permafrost thaw, unprecedented wildfires. I see Alexander from the Gwich'in Council here, and he's been working in that space, and he's told me a little bit about how his community has been so harshly impacted by that. A shrinking Greenland ice sheet. I mean, I could go on and on, but I don't need to for this audience because you know. In fact, many of you here are working on climate change, including how to identify ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I want to applaud your efforts. I'm, of course, am not a scientist. I'm a diplomat. I'm, some might say, a bureaucrat in the government, but we also play a part in this effort. Now, the U.S., back in fall 2022, we put out a new U.S. national strategy for the Arctic region, also called the NSAR, is the acronym. And this strategy prioritizes climate across multiple dimensions, including adaptation, the need to strengthen resilience to climate impacts for Arctic communities and Indigenous peoples in particular. Security, the need to integrate climate science into security planning, and particularly to better understand and to prepare for possible new threats to U.S. security. For instance, how can the U.S. increase the resilience of critical infrastructure, ports, power grids, military installations, and of course, science. The NSAR makes clear that we want to expand scientific cooperation among Arctic partners, including through the Arctic Council, to update, for example, things like we want to strengthen our black carbon and methane reduction goals. But we also want to better understand Arctic's so-called tipping points, things like permafrost thaw, ice sheet mass loss, which potentially could have catastrophic impacts across the world. In fact, there's now a separate implementation plan for the NSAR that has incorporated multiple lines of effort in terms of how can we adapt, how can we mitigate. It includes many things, such as funding opportunities for Alaska Native communities to strengthen their climate resilience capacity, including through grants from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And Washington's also collaborating with the state of Alaska on state and community-specific response plans that account for climate change and other Arctic regional considerations. Now, I'm really pleased that my good colleague Morten Høglund from the Arctic Council is here with us today because he might be able to speak a little bit about Norway's chairship of the Council and the important role that the Council plays in addressing change in the Arctic. In fact, some of you may know that the Arctic Council has a strategic plan put out in 2021, and the very first strategic goal is related to monitoring, assessing, and highlighting the impacts of climate change in the Arctic, including stress on the need to strengthen cooperation on adaptation and resilience. To give just one way that the Arctic Council prioritizes this is by its expansion of clean energy cooking and heating projects in the Arctic. And I also want to say that there's a lot of excellent research, a lot of excellent projects that are being done, not just in the Arctic Council, but elsewhere. But I think a real value of the Arctic Council is not only its ability to help use science for a comprehensive understanding of the changes underway in the Arctic, but how it can communicate and interpret this science for policymakers directly in government, including in Washington, where I live. So that's a major reason why the United States seeks to sustain the Arctic Council as the principal multilateral forum for the Arctic. And I just want to commend Norway and Morten in particular for the outstanding leadership that you have provided. So to conclude, thanks again for having me here today. And as the United States pursues initiatives to address the magnitude of climate change and change overall in the Arctic, one of my primary responsibilities in my role is to listen to the ideas, to the thoughts, to what you've been saying here by these scientists, the researchers, young and old, by Indigenous knowledge holders, the people on this stage, the people in this room, and to help me translate your ideas into policy. The Arctic Congress has been outstanding. It's been great for that, and I look forward to hearing more. Thanks.
Thank you. We have heard about Arctic Council, and we are proud of Arctic Council, and I tend to quote from or tell about Mikhail Gorbachev in Murmansk in 1987. That was the speech that sort of initiated the creation of Arctic Council a few years later. But you have been chairing Arctic Council for 1 year now, Morten. It's the mid of your time in Arctic Council as a chair. So please tell us, what have you achieved and what is hard to achieve in the situation without Russia participating very eagerly because of the geopolitical situation, of course?
Thank you, Anna. I will try to approach the question in my own way. And 20 years ago, approximately this year, exactly this year, the Arctic Council came out with a massive report on climate change, which for the first time, at least from the Arctic Council perspective, actually the first time globally, pointing to what was happening in the Arctic with rapid climate change. After that, Arctic Council has been providing insight into the IPCC, to what's happening, together with so many others. We are well placed to observe what's happening in the Arctic, and we work with scientists globally. But the uniqueness of the Arctic Council, and Sara was going through the history, because there was a history previous, and this was one part of the history. Sara took another part of the history. The indigenous peoples in the Arctic came together and actually paved, found a direction for cooperation. And this unique setting, having the peoples and states coming together, sitting together at every table, every single table of the organization. And when we are able to come together on a message or agree on project, and there's a lot of agreements which are not grand scale, but we agree on cooking projects and concrete steps, but also on the strategy, preserving livelihoods for people, looking after the people. That has a strong resonance when we are united. That can be heard on the global stage. So in that respect, we have a role to play in informing about what's happening in the Arctic, what can be done, how the rest of the world can support what we are doing. Black carbon has been mentioned. It's one issue we have to deal with, but a lot of the black carbon emissions are coming from outside the Arctic. We are engaging with observer states, but also non-observer states who need to take responsibility. In Bodø, before this Congress, we were blessed to have all over 6 indigenous organizations with us in some form to discuss and sit with them as the chair of the council and get ideas and discuss, as we have been doing a few times already. This time we added another level. We invited the permanent participants, indigenous, to bring with them youth representatives. And it gives fresh perspective, new insights. But what's been evident and obvious, and also through this discussion, is almost everything we discuss Every issue which is part of the agenda of the Council has a relevance to the climate and environment. And what is happening now, wildland fires, extreme weather, the melting, the permafrost, it all affects the mental health issues, our ability on food security. It's all interlinked. And also in that sense, the Arctic Council, there were wise people before the 90s, but also in the 90s, thinking, how should the Arctic Council look like? We can always improve. We have a lot to do. It's challenging times. But I must say, when we were sitting together in Bodø, not far from this, discussing, there were also Russians part of that discussion. So it's not like nothing is going on. A lot of things are not normal, but under the radar, away from the media spotlight. A lot of work is being done, and you have some of these people are sitting here with us today. Okay.
So after listening to you now, it's tempting to not ask the questions we prepared. So I will challenge you a little bit and say, how is the Earth in 5 years' time? Based on your knowledge and your view on the future, if we manage to keep the temperature within 3 degrees increase, perhaps, it's a medium foresight. What about you, Nicole, and your relocation project? How many people have had to leave their homes if things are developing in even more climate change happening?
That's a really good question. There's a lot of literature that looks at projections on climate mobility and displacement as a result of worsening climate impacts. We don't always want to assume the worst, but there is still hope to adapt, to mitigate climate change. But there are a lot of projections saying that relocation will become increasingly urgent moving into the future. Upwards, from what I remember reading, tens of millions of people in the next 20 years, is projected. But that doesn't mean that relocation is the only adaptation option available. It's not going to work for every different community. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's super complicated, it's politically charged, it's very controversial, and there are other adaptation options that we can pursue alongside our mitigative efforts, and hopefully we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and try and avoid some of those tipping points. But relocation is viewed to be a last resort, and if all other measures failed, our land becomes uninhabitable. It is something that very well may be much more common in the future.
I would like to ask Sara and Julius, both of you, how do you see the future if we develop like we do today? And how could we adapt better? Sara, please.
Well, I think that this past year in Galashitunat has been a very daunting testament to the changes that we're seeing. When we were on our way to the climate COP in Dubai, we were looking at the news in Greenland, seeing that the child rights spokesperson was expressing her concern about communities in the north who had not had the access to hunt because the ice didn't settle, who were not able to feed neither their families or the dogs for the dog teams, and where life has changed immensely due to the climate change. Of course, there has been adaptation, but the pace of the climate change and the direct impact is so tangible. And I think that in some communities around the Arctic and in Inuit especially, we have seen that change for decades. We also, that same fall, had heavy snowfall in South Greenland that was a surprise to the sheep herders, resulting in a crisis for them, losing a lot of sheep in an already heavily challenged business. So I fully recognize that we often talk about what we can do to keep the business wheels running. but we cannot close our eyes to those immediate changes that are affecting people directly. And if we then take that to the negotiations, for example, at the COPs, we have another COP coming up, of course, and other negotiations. This is where we still see the inequity. Arctic indigenous peoples are currently not in a position to access the climate funding mechanisms that are set up under the UNFCCC framework. For example, human rights are not integrated into these documents as the basic principle for everything that is done, as another example. And when we talk about just transition, we do not discuss in depth justice for whom. We try to push, for example, in the International Maritime Organization, that when we talk about transition, we talk about equitable transition, just an equitable transition. And I think as a community, a world community, we have to change our ways of thinking and know that when we do international agreements, we have to take into account those that are the marginalized, who have adapted for centuries and millennia, but where now the situation is so critical that if we don't succeed on the international arena, we will continue with new forms of colonization. So I think that's a challenge that we truly have to address and bring us with us from the Arctic into all we do on the international arena as well.
Well, I can just echo a lot of what Sara said, but I'll just repurpose that to the situation of the Samis. I mean, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the reindeer herders are struggling, and if it continues with the trajectory as it is now, it will certainly not bode well. It is a situation of despair and hopelessness if it continues like that. And well, for the reindeer herders, they do experience like thick layers of ice in the snow, which makes it so that the reindeers cannot punch through the snow. And one notorious winter of that was the 2019-2020 winter. But I've heard that this winter was also very challenging for many reindeer herders. So yeah, but what we need in I was thinking about the question about what if we manage to mitigate climate change and how it would look like in 5 years' time. If we manage to do that, then it would be positive for the reindeer herders in the sense that the most important thing to them is preparedness. It is predictability in this climate. If they get that in some way, then it can be of great help to them. But of course, the damage is already done in many ways. For instance, in the community where I'm from, in the river I'm from, well, it has already been destroyed by the effects of climate change. So yeah, the decline of the salmon populations in Dapno, like Atlantic salmon, and the introduction of an invasive species called pink salmon, well, that is something that's I wouldn't say irreversible, because that would imply I have no hope, but it is hard to reverse that. And it really makes me fear as a young person for the future of the traditional knowledge that has been the basis of my upbringing in that area, and the basis of my resilience in this changing climate. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's really make an impression when a young man like you have hopelessness as the future. The future is hopeless. Mm-hmm. So I really hope that we can get more time next time we can discuss and see what could be done exactly to make your future less hopeless. But we will listen to the three other participants. And Kikki, how is the world looking in 5 years' time?
In 5 years' time, during those 5 years, we've realized that we need a sense of urgency, which is out of scale to what we have today. We realize that there's no pause button on anything that is happening. And the fastest changes are happening in Arctic, so the fastest response also has to happen in this region. And we see there are so many regulatory mechanisms that are so slow to respond to the needs in these regions. There's a complete mismatch in the need and the time it takes to change regulations, which means that so much more will have to be done on the ground, on the people who knows best and has the knowledge of how to themselves manage ecosystems. Because we often come in, and I say we, and from Bergen or southern Norway or other places in Europe, and have focus on one species or one tree or one thing that we care about. It's the whole multitude of an ecosystem that has to be preserved. And that whole idea of landscape thinking is something that we have to take into account. Because yes, people have lived in this region, archaeological evidence for thousands of years, and lived with lots of changing climate. But the rapidity of climate change now means that we have an intersection with these regulatory systems and the socio-economical situation, which makes the situation even more vulnerable. So how do we go beyond the climate change and actually look at what other stressors are making people in this region vulnerable, and how do we overcome that? Why are we still not have a plan for moving coastal communities higher up on land? Because the erosion is not going to end in those 5 years. Why don't we have a plan for making sure that pipelines and wind farms are not are actually stopping people from making sure that they could move and be more flexible when they hunt or when they use the resources that belong to them? So we have a long way to go, but we have a complete different speed thinking that we need to get into now. We've been extremely slow, and we're meeting and we're discussing, and there's a lot of good things that happen when high-level people meet and discuss. The problem is the response time have to increase.
But do you think it's very easy for politicians to take decisions that will affect our welfare system?
No, because the hardest thing we do is to think about how we're going to put money and policy into a scenario which is so far into the future, right? So that sense of urgency doesn't exist in policy, but it clearly exists on the ground. So maybe that should be a little bit better integrated.
Time is running, and I think it is a quick statement in 20 seconds for each of you. And we start with you, Morten.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, because I'm here from the Arctic Council, that for us it's important now to concentrate on what we actually can do. Yeah. Not necessarily the things we obviously cannot do. So we have the Wildland Fire Initiative, which has been very important for us in the Council, and it's also extremely climate related. We had a very successful ecosystem-based management approach conference in Tromsø in April on oceans. A lot of good projects coming out of that. So concrete work. We are strengthening the youth perspective, the youth voice within the council, trying to work with the Indigenous Peoples Organization to strengthen the Indigenous perspective in everything we do. It's a tall order, it's a long way to go, but the discussion has started. So finding, and the cryosphere, I just lastly want to mention, we have trying to step up on the cryosphere. So there is so much we can do despite the geopolitical challenges. So it's not like we sitting back waiting for everything to be perfect. It's a lot of work, as Kikki said, has to start now. Unfortunately, we cannot solve everything.
23 seconds.
Okay. It's really easy, it happens to me, to get depressed when you see, the movie, you see the worst case scenarios, and it's like, oh my goodness. And, Julius, you talked about this loss of hope. But at the same time, I'm also kind of optimistic. Not that climate change is going to be reversed or stopped, or there won't be some severe impacts that will just grow, but that we're going to learn from the mistakes we've made, that the progress that we have made, it's not been perfect, Sarah's pointed that out, but we're going to build upon that. And the people who are going to do that the best are the people to my left, the younger generation. And that's why it's important, as Morten said, to incorporate their voices in the Arctic Council, because they're going to take this struggle, against climate change, and they're going to lead it, and they're going to learn from our mistakes, and they're going to do better.
So let's give a big hand to the young people, to the hope for the future. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience.